Hi all, today we look into GATE Biotechnology 2017 paper, question number 55. The question is, which of the following conditions promote the development of human autoimmune disorders? Option P, inability to eliminate self-reactive lymphocytes. Q, generation of autoantibodies. R, ability to eliminate self-reactive T cells. And S, induction of regulatory T cells in the thymus. So the given options are option A, P and R are correct, and option B, Q and S, option C, P and Q, and option D, R and S. To understand this, let's look at how autoimmune disorders arise. So we know that the immune system is responsible for protecting our body's normal cells from invading pathogens or abnormal cells, like in case of cancer. So several complications could arise when the immune system does not function properly. For example, immune deficiencies arise when the immune system does not function enough. And hypersensitivity arises when the immune cells overreact. And autoimmunity is when the immune cells are misdirected. That is, they attack cells that they are not supposed to attack. So, by definition, autoimmunity is the inability of the immune system to differentiate between self and non self. That is, the immune cells or antibodies produced by them consider the body's own normal cells to be foreign and reacts or attacks them. So, this causes structural or functional damage to the tissues. So, there are more than 40 autoimmune diseases affecting about 5 to 7% of adults. So some examples are myasthenia gravis, Graves' disease, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes mellitus, pernicious anemia, and so on. And further, for a condition to be called autoimmune, it has to satisfy these three requirements. So the first one is the presence of an immune reaction specific for some self-antigen or self-tissue, while that reaction is a primary reaction without being secondary to any underlying tissue damage, and there is no other well-defined cause of the disease. So self-antigens are receptors on the surface of cells. The immune system uses these self-antigens as identifiers to recognize a cell that belongs to the body it is protecting. So self-antigens also inform immune cells that antigens from the cell should be immunologically tolerated. That is, they should not be killed. So the normal immune system must differentiate between self and non-self. So self-tolerance is the lack of response to our own antigens and underlies our ability to live in harmony with our cells and tissues. So autoimmunity results from the loss of self-tolerance. So this tolerance can either be central tolerance or peripheral tolerance, and let's look into the details of these. So central tolerance is when immature self-reacting lymphocytes like T or B cells that recognize self-antigens in the central lymphoid organs die by apoptosis or other fates. For example, immature T cells are killed by apoptosis by negative selection in the thymus, or they escape this killing process and they differentiate into regulatory T cells that are not self-reactive. And in the B cell lineage, some are killed by apoptosis, while some switch to new antigen receptors in the bone marrow that are not self-reactive. So this is central tolerance. And peripheral tolerance is when mature self-reactive lymphocytes that recognize self-antigens in the peripheral tissues are inactivated by a mechanism called anergy, or killed by apoptosis, or suppressed by regulatory T cells. So anergy is the functional inactivation of lymphocytes when they encounter antigens. So T cell activation requires two signals. So the first signal is the recognition of peptide antigen in association with self-MHC molecules on antigen presenting cells and co-stimulatory signals from these antigen presenting cells. So if the co-stimulatory molecules are weak, that is, if signal 2 is not delivered, the T cells become anergic and they cannot respond to the antigen. So this is peripheral, like one of the mechanisms of peripheral tolerance. So the other mechanism is suppression by regulatory T cells. So regulatory T cells are CD4 positive cells that express high levels of CD25 markers as well. So they are generated upon recognition of self-antigens in the thymus and requires the transcription factor FOXP3. So regulatory T cells are not formed if there are mutations in this FOXP3 gene, and this leads to a regulatory T cell deficiency and causes an autoimmune disease IPEX in humans. Another way is by apoptosis or cell death upon recognition of self-antigen by FAS or BCL mediated apoptotic pathways. So mutations in these genes lead to autoimmune diseases. Like for example, mutations in FAS gene are responsible for an autoimmune disease ALPS. So the condition of autoimmunity arises when the discussed self-tolerance mechanisms fail. So the failure of these central and peripheral tolerance mechanisms could be either due to genetic inheritance of genes disrupting the tolerance pathways or infections that expose self-antigens and activate the antigen-presenting cells and lymphocytes in tissues, leading to producing antibodies against the self-antigens. So the immune cells they recognize the receptors of the normal cells and they just kill the body's normal functioning cells. So this is the idea behind autoimmune disorders and how the failure of the immune system leads to them. So coming back to a question, which of the following conditions promote the development of human autoimmune disorders? So option P is the inability to eliminate self-reactive lymphocytes. So this option is correct. So like we saw, the self-reactive lymphocytes are either killed by apoptosis or are inactivated or they are suppressed by regulatory T cells. So the failure to do that, the inability to eliminate these lymphocytes, leads to autoimmune disorders. So option P is correct. So now the answer could be either A or C. And then option Q is the generation of autoantibodies. So this is also true. So when the immune cells, they recognize the self-antigens, they produce antibodies against these self-antigens. So these are called autoantibodies. So this is correct as well. So option P and Q are correct. So the answer to this question would be option C. So let's just look at the other options. R and S. So R is the ability to eliminate self-reactive T cells. So this is wrong. So the ability to eliminate the self-reactive T cells is tolerance. So if that is the case, we wouldn't have any autoimmune disorders because that is how the body normally functions. It's supposed to eliminate the self-reactive lymphocytes. And then option S is the induction of regulatory T cells in the thymus. So when these immature T cells, they recognize the self-antigens, either autoimmunity arises or they could be differentiated further into regulatory T cells. So these regulatory T cells, they do not recognize self-antigens. So this does not lead to autoimmune disorders. So these two are not the answers to the question. So option P and Q are the answers to this question. Thank you.